Welcome to the Voteboard, the election prediction podcast. We get you the inside information you need to handicap elections. I'm your host, the chairman of the Voteboard, David Dermer. Today, we're exploring the world of Mississippi politics. Incumbent Republican Governor Tate Reeves is being challenged by Democrat Public Service Commissioner and former small-town mayor Brandon Presley. Would it be madness to bet a Democrat could win the Magnolia state? We'll ask our guest, 45-year Mississippi political veteran Keith Hurd. Keith has been involved in all things Mississippi his whole life. Now, keep in mind, betting on elections in the United States is illegal, but we can talk about betting on elections all we want. Now, let's get ready to get into the nitty-gritty of the Mississippi governor's race. Mr. Keith Hurd, thank you for joining us. Keith, if I may call you Keith, is a maven of Mississippi politics. You've been at this game for over 45 years, from what I understand. That's a good long time. If you could tell me a little bit about your history in Mississippi and getting into politics and where you've gone.
Absolutely. It's good to be on the show with you. I got started quite young. My daddy ran for the state senate in 1967 when I was 11 years old. And I helped in that race, passed out cards, and he lost that race by 10 votes. They had a recount, and he lost by 3 votes. And the attorneys wanted him to appeal. He thought he could win, and it would cost $5,000. And he said, I don't have $5,000. So my first election, I saw how tough it can be, and a recount was involved in the first one. But professionally, I got started in 1978 with Senator Thad Cochran. He was a congressman, and he was running for the Senate. And I've just graduated from college and went to work in his campaign as a district director, and then I started traveling with him. Then I go to Washington, was special assistant to the senator for 6 years, worked in his reelection, stayed in Washington, and became a lobbyist for Cotton Council.
Before you leave your Cochran experience, if you could, I know that you were deeply involved in that famous runoff campaign, and right. I'd very much, if you could just give our viewers a little bit of Mississippi political history, because that was one of the most exciting races in the state's history as far as a comeback that was very much not prognosticated. Tell me about that race and that runoff, if you would.
Well, it was an interesting dynamic was going on at that time. Senator Cochran had won multiple races by double-digit numbers. One of the most beloved politicians in the state. He had served for 30 years, and in 2014, the Tea Party had started becoming involved over the last 4 or 5 years, and they had the Tea Party movement moving mainly out of South Mississippi. And Chris McDaniel was his name, and he came out and started running against him in a primary. I think the Cochran people were caught flat-footed, frankly. I wasn't involved with the campaign at that time. I was obviously a supporter. And they did not run a good campaign. They were forced into a runoff. Senator Cochran, frankly, was lucky to be in a runoff. There was a third-party candidate that got like 1.2% of the vote. So they were both over 49%. And so that night, the senator told me to go straighten that mess out tomorrow. So I basically took over the campaign. I did take over the campaign as chairman the next day. We revamped the campaign. We had to turn out the vote effort and working hard. And the interesting thing, if you had not voted in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, you could still vote in the runoff. But if you had voted in the Democratic primary, you could not vote in the Republican runoff.
So you were able to identify those voters that were floating around out there and coalesce them to vote for your man, Senator Cochran.
That's exactly right. And we were very aggressive. We went after Republicans that didn't vote. We went after Democrats that didn't vote in the Democratic primary. We were just Mississippians trying to get Senator Cochran reelected.
How were you able to do that, Keith? How were you able to do that with the time pressures that you had in a time when 2014 you don't have the technological advantages that you do in 2023?
That's right. And I tell you, first thing I did the first day after we started, we changed the whole message. We before in the primary they were trying to out conservative the Tea Party candidate. They weren't. Senator Cochran had gotten older. He wasn't an active hardcore campaigner. Although I think they protected him too much because I turned him loose, and he worked hard and worked the crowds and did a great job doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just assigned people. I would take somebody that ran a state campaign and put them in charge of one county, like Madison County, just outside Jackson. Put somebody in charge of Lauderdale County and two or three counties around it. People in charge of the Delta, somebody in charge of the coast. And basically, I would tell them, tell me what you need, and I'll make a decision and get it to you as quickly as possible. And in campaigns, a lot of times they don't make decisions.
Right.
We didn't have time to wait. We had to make decisions and move on, whether it was right or wrong.
In a campaign, you get a lot of chefs in the kitchen, but you needed to have some leadership and move to get on the ground very, very quickly.
That's
and,
right.
That is you being the architect of that campaign, saving that campaign. Actually, it's quite an admirable feat on your part. Let me get a little bit further along here and talk about the state of Mississippi, which you know such a great deal of. If you could tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about the different regions in Mississippi, the strongholds of different voter percentages. Describe it for us a little bit, if you would.
Yeah. Well, I basically divide the state up into 5 regions with a couple of subsets inside those 5. But you have the hills, and the Northeast Hills is a subset of there. Interestingly, the hills outside of Oxford, they were the last blue dog Democrats. They voted Democrat even at the federal level up into the 80s. But they're now very loyal and very strong and staunch Republican area. Then you have the Mississippi Delta, which is mainly Democratic. Benny Thompson is the representative there, and if we get votes there, we do have a lot of Republicans, but it's not enough to win those counties. Then you have Central Mississippi that basically runs from Columbus down to Meridian, down not quite to Hattiesburg and over to the Louisiana line, and that includes the Jackson Metro. So that's another region. They tend to be good, solid Republican votes, but they do show a tendency to vote Democrat sometimes. And then you have what we call the I-59 corridor that basically runs from Meridian to New Orleans, or Pearl River County. It used to be the old Pine Belt. That was the basis of the whole Tea Party movement. Jones County is the middle of the Free State of Jones. You may remember the movie.
From the movie, etc. Yes.
Yeah, and that they think very differently from other parts of the state. Good people, solid people.
So historically, they have more of an independent nature to them, you would say. Yes.
That's right. Okay. And they went more Tea Party-ish, and they thought Senator Cochran had been there too long. He'd gotten too old. Then you have the Gulf Coast, primarily the 6 coastal counties, but 3 across the coast. They're very much for Republican. So those 5 groups come together, and the only real strong Democratic place is Hinds County and the 2nd Congressional District. Then we're just fighting over different levels of conservatism.
Keith, you could see that obviously in the dynamic of the state, where statewide pretty much is all Republican. You've got I believe you have a supermajority legislature Republican now. You've got 3 out of the 4 congressional seats are Republican. So I'm going to ask you the question when we finish up the governor's race. I'm going to ask you to kind of flip yourself around a little bit and tell me, can a Democrat win in Mississippi, and if so, how? So I'm going to let you think about that for a little bit before you can I lost you there for a minute. Oh, you're with us, Keith. Okay, good. I lost you a little on the eye. I didn't want to chase you away with that question, but but that keep under your hat, and I'm going to come back to that. But let's talk about the
Okay.
governor's race if we could. And let's talk about the two candidates. You have Governor Tate Reeves, who's up for reelection. And he is, from what I gather and from what my research told me, a very unpopular governor, one of the most unpopular in the country. However, he is also touting, as incumbents do, a lot of positives about his record that he's talking about: low unemployment and gains in education, investment in the state, response to the Jackson water crisis, and especially Mississippi conservative values. Could you expand on that at all and tell me a little bit about the governor? Because I'm sure you're intimately familiar with him and his background.
Yeah, and it's interesting how a lot of times Tate does poll as unpopular, but it's not that way out in the field. It's not like that for the people that are voting that I find. Um, he won very big when he was lieutenant governor, but he had the same attitude about him at that point. And one reason he developed this image was while he was lieutenant governor, he was the one that would say no to a lot of things. And they would pass it in the House, and he wouldn't even put it before the committee in the Senate. So he got a reputation of being tough, and it got out of control, and it turned it that people made him unpopular. But truly, if you look at the votes and how people vote for him, he is popular, and he always gets over 50% of the vote.
That's interesting. So you think this polling is just not accurate? It just doesn't tell the story?
I just don't think it tells the story because it certainly doesn't
Okay.
at the end of the campaign. But it shows, like in the latest poll with the Mississippi Today Siena College poll, they had, and this is where he's supposed to be unpopular, and he's winning by 11 points.
Well, it's also, they're doing a poll against an opponent rather than an approval on a particular individual, approval, disapproval.
Right.
So those things can be very different. Let's talk about his opponent, if you would. Mr. Brandon Presley, who is a former public service commissioner and former small town mayor as well. Some of the issues that he's been talking about is what I found very interesting: the grocery tax. The idea that I've heard a couple of different reports, but there's only a handful of states that have a tax on groceries, Mississippi being the highest at 7% of a tax on groceries. So he's working that issue. He wants to expand Medicaid. Also, the scandal that hit national news. I've heard anywhere from $77 to $90 million on the welfare embezzlement scandal. Of course, people know about it more because of the hook of Brett Favre and the volleyball court, which is a small portion of all of that. But you've had people that have been indicted and gone to prison now with lengthy prison sentences. And Presley seems to be hammering away at the governor because he fired the key investigative prosecutor in the case. How do you think this stuff is sticking?
Well, it's first off, Brandon is still currently public service commissioner. He's running as an incumbent, and he is until January. Brandon is a good person. He's a friend of mine. We just differ on politics, and he's a good, solid campaigner. He's liked, but there's a big difference between running for governor and running for public service commissioner. I mean, he raised money from Republicans when he was running for public service commissioner, but that didn't translate into his governor's race very well. So he's a good speaker, gives great speeches, and a hard campaigner. And he is hitting, the thing he's hitting most right now is the scandal. And I think that's not sticking too much to Tate Reeves because Tate had nothing to do with it. The governor at that time was lieutenant governor. The governor was in charge. It was Phil Bryant. So, and from what I can tell, it hadn't stuck to Tate Reeves. Now, this latest thing that the governor's brother, Todd Reeves, was doing some emailing, texting back and forth with Brett Favre, and the auditor kind of raised it and gave Brandon a little more juice there. But I don't think the campaign's going to be won or lost on that.
So you don't see that as it's not really translating it into some vote
No,
momentum for Presley.
I
You
just
don't
don't
see
see
that
that.
happening.
I think where he has a better bang for his buck running is on the Medicaid issue. Now, if you can
Okay.
believe that poll I just mentioned, Mississippi Today and the Cinema College, now they claim that 77% of the people of Mississippi support Medicaid expansion now, and it was only at 33% 4 years ago. I'm not sure about that. If it's that high, but if it is, they're still supporting Tate Reeves over Brandon Presley in spite of Tate's position of no Medicaid expansion.
Well, it seems that also the governor is trying to link uh, Brandon Presley to the national progressives, so to speak, the National Democratic Party. I've seen that he's talking a great deal about Mississippi conservative values, and that Presley is, out of the realm of what Mississippians want. Presley, of course, is arguing or touting the fact that he believes that the governor doesn't know what ordinary Mississippians are going through. So you've got that dynamic, but I got to tell you, looking at the numbers as far as the Pew polling that has come out, you've got ideologically, you know this, of course, Mississippi is a very conservative state, 62%. Right. Ideologically, you've got black conservatives also out there from a social standpoint. And, obviously in a lot of southern states, the racial background and breakdown is very significant, with approximately 56% white Republicans, and you've got about 36% black right. Democrats in your breakdown of voter demographic. So once again, circling back to that question, with all that going on, how can a Democrat win the state of Mississippi?
Well, I'll say this: a Democrat cannot win Mississippi in a federal election except in the Mississippi Delta. For U.S. Senator, for Congressman, in anywhere but the Delta, the Republican wins. The governor is a different race from the national campaign. And if you put together that the African American vote, turn out to vote big, then you have so many white Democrats that vote, so that kicks it up to about 43, 44%. So then you're fighting over 6%.
Keith, I think what you said about turnout is most interesting, because in me looking at that in the right. midterms, as you well know, Mississippi had some of the lowest turnout, maybe the lowest turnout, at 36%. So with low turnout, I don't know how a Democrat can overcome the standard locked-in votes. A low turnout benefits the Republican,
no question,
of course.
It does, but it benefits the Republican. Yeah. And another problem that Brandon has is the state Democratic Party is in shambles. They had a chairman before that was wasn't respected in the National Democratic Party. They got crossways. He left in the middle of the campaign as Democratic chairman, and they have a new chairman, but he's hard to get your legs under you in this election so quickly. To have a huge turnout, you have to have a lot of money, which means the National Democratic Party would have to put dollars in to turn out the vote for Brandon Presley, and I just don't see that happen.
And what I've seen is when they do put the money in, then the governor immediately says, look, they're buying the election for the national progressives, and that's not what Mississippi's about. So it's kind of a two-edged sword that they're working over there. I tell you something about as an outsider watching the election, I think that Brandon Presley does have a bit of charisma to him. He's got that intangible, nice speaker and all, like you were mentioning. And, of course, the little hook of being Elvis Presley's cousin or second cousin, that's something that kind of gets him some notoriety. But so as far as the vote board is concerned and making the odds, we're looking at Governor Tate Reeves is being a strong favorite to win the Mississippi governor with 1-2 odds, with a implied probability of 66.7% and a money line of -200. So you'd have to bet 200 to make 100. Brandon Presley, we got at 9-5 with a 35.7% probability and a +180. You got to bet 100 to get back 180. So that's pretty much where we're at on this thing. Things can happen, elections, all kinds of things between now and Election Day in November. Let me ask you, as a guest of the Vote Board, Keith, do you see it any differently?
And let me say one other thing I wanted to say about when we were talking about turnout and party apparatus. Something else Tate has in his favor is Frank Bordeaux is the state chairman. He's one of the best state chairmen I've seen in my career in politics. So we have an organized state party. He's energized it, and they work very closely with the RNC. And so while you have Presley mired down with the Democratic Party in shambles, you have the opposite going in the Republican Party, plus an advantage built in. So if that said, I think that your numbers are pretty spot on. But I think Tate wins with 53% of the vote, or maybe 54%. And the only thing I would differ is I don't think Presley has 35% chance to win, even though Tate's not beating him that many points, 5 or 6 points. I just think that the odds of him beating Governor Reeves is much less than that.
Okay, well, I hear that, and I respect that fact. And obviously, you have been a longtime Republican person involved in Republican politics, so I could see where you're coming on that. It's hard to give a little bit more of an advantage than you would expect the other way. But like I say, the dynamics of the state as we've gone through really are built in for the R's. Trump carried the state 16%. I think he carried it by 16%. It's going to very, very tough state for a D. And once again, I appreciate, Keith, you being with us and sharing your expertise and your knowledge, your history. And I hope we could call on you again, because you really, really know Mississippi and everything that is Mississippi.
Well, I appreciate it, and I've enjoyed talking with you. I've always enjoyed talking politics, and especially races like this one. It's going to be interesting. We only have 3 governor's races going on right now, so I know you're giving them all a lot of attention, and that's important for the country to hear.
Thank you so much again, Keith. I appreciate you being with us.